Now, he isn't good looking like most movie stars. He isn't a powerful remote presence like so many movie stars. Instead, he has average looks, barely wears any makeup, has a goofy grin, and usually doesn't seem like he's acting at all. And yet, Bill Murray is one of the hottest box office stars in the country right now, having assembled one big comedy hit after another for a half dozen most profitable years. He's hotter than Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy had a bomb. He's hotter than Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor's had bombs. Not in comedies. Bill Murray, one hit after another in his comedies. His very name in a movie comedy promises a good time to millions of young filmgoers. Now, what's the secret of this seemingly average guy being so successful?
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of The Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Hey everyone, welcome to Back to the Balcony. I'm your host Antonio here with my co-host Justin Henson of The Movie Wire. Justin, how you doing?
Fantastic. And this one is going to be a fun conversation. I've been waiting a couple of weeks for this one.
Yeah, we've had some scheduling issues and we're finally doing it. That's why we stay a few episodes ahead, although you guys would never know it unless we told you. And I'm excited for this episode because it is our first real kind of off-topic episode of this new season. We've already done some listener requests, we've done some of our picks, and now we're going to do something like we did last year where we had our Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy episode, some of our special award episodes, and this one is actually, I'm not going to say a listener request, it was a listener suggestion about how they did this profile of careers with Bill Murray. Now, to get people into the idea of time frame here, this is 1984, hot off of the release of Ghostbusters. So I feel that with the success of Ghostbusters, which we've mentioned on the show many times because they keep comparing movies to it, this is kind of like their career profile with Bill Murray. And there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to hear them say about him that I feel maybe was the early representation of what his career was during that time, because it definitely changed in the 80s and 90s. Go back and see our Scrooged episode where they even have a different opinion about what he was doing then. But yeah, it's really interesting to go back and see what these two thought about an artist's career up to that point and where they thought his future was. And what did you think about their opinion of Bill Murray circa 1984?
Well, I love Gene's intro because he always has to go for the looks, and that's so Gene at this point. But
it is.
Bill Murray, to me, that kind of was a compliment because I'm reminded of Walter Matthau, who has the looks of somebody a mother can only love. He has that unique style that really entices you to the average Joe. And that shouldn't be taken as a bad thing because people relate to the average Joe. They relate to the unique looks, and Murray uses it to his advantage. He is very confident in his own skin to really utilize how his reactions are based on the average. And whenever somebody comments on Bill Murray's looks, I always think back to how he goes all in on Kingpin, where he has that ridiculousness, the over-the-top looks. And that is something that is very unique with Murray. And for Gene to kind of start this episode at the look portion of it, I take that as a compliment.
I take it as a compliment too. And especially at this point in his career, where he is mostly known from his Saturday Night Live stint, essentially kind of taking Chevy Chase's place in that goofy pratfall kind of lovable asshole character that we've talked about Chevy Chase in the past. He kind of filled that role in on Saturday Night Live. And then little by little, as they talk about in this episode, getting smaller parts to bigger parts through the late 70s, early 90s it's a handful of movies, but they are known as the pantheon of 80s and late 70s comedies. And mostly because of him being in them. The movies are funny themselves. Some of them haven't aged that well, but we always remember the Bill Murray roles in those. And then I feel like it really did hit its apex in 1984 with Ghostbusters, where you can see that Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis wrote this movie as like a 3-person team ensemble piece. Ivan Reitman directs it that way. But the performance of Murray as Peter Venkman kind of just solidifies the movie around him. I don't think it's written that way. It just is that way because of his presence. And I think that became the template for Bill Murray performances and movies written either for him or with him, essentially for the rest of his career.
Murray has this magic to him where, and I think I said it in the Scrooge review, where you have to have a Bill Murray script. You have to have the anticipation of what Murray's going to do. And in his early career, he really did utilize to be that one voice to just break through every single performance, whether it was Caddyshack, whether it was Ghostbusters, whatever it may be. But he is the most memorable piece of the early 80s of all these movies that shouldn't have been big, but they were big. And Murray played a big part in that because he, walking out of a movie theater, if I was an adult, if I was a critic, if I was just the general audience, I would walk out saying, that guy is absolutely amazing because he really embodies. He doesn't care about the rest of the cast, and we see that in his later career where we do see some conflict. He knows exactly who he is and what he needs to accomplish, and he needs to be that alpha that really does break through in the cinematic world. And it's a forte in the early 80s, and I even go back to Little Shop of Horrors, where it's a small role, but he goes all in on that role for the spotlight, even against Steve Martin, that is supposed to be the focus in that scene. So that is what would define Bill Murray's career going forward.
I think there is like a duality to the guy's performances from the very start till current times. And I'm not going to say it's like a disrespect for a filmmaker or a disrespect for the writing of the movie, but I feel like if he is in love with the material and he's confident in the director who's guiding him through it, that he will give a very committed and restrained performance, and oftentimes does it very well. But at the same time, if you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. And you can always see the differences in those performances. So they talk about it a little bit. I didn't capture all the audio because there was a lot of rambling in the episode. But if we look at his earliest roles, Caddyshack, Meatballs, and Stripes, those are the give him an inch, he'll take a mile role, right? Now, they do talk a little bit about when he plays Hunter S. Thompson in Where the Buffalo Roam, which I agree with them. Amazing performance, not an amazing movie. I like it because I am a Hunter S. Thompson fan, but I am perfectly aware that it is not the best made film, even though he gives an amazing performance. And so does Peter Boyle as essentially the Dr. Gonzo character or their version of it. But it is like the testing grounds of what else can he do other than be the improv comic that's on screen? Can he capture a character and can he maintain it over a 90-minute, 2-hour movie? And in that case, he can. And so then when we get to Tootsie in 1982, where he plays the uncredited role of Dustin Hoffman's roommate, well, that's an amazing and memorable performance because he understands that it's not the Bill Murray show. And so he pulls it back and he's there to assist Dustin Hoffman in that role and let Dustin Hoffman be the character that we know and love as Tootsie. So it goes to show that he does have restraint when he needs it.
He does have restraint, and this is where we see it in his career, where it solely depends on the director and, like you said, the material. If he has some sort of buy-in in the material, it's going to be the director's job to build that rapport with Murray, to make sure that the vision is clear, because Murray can have a vision, the director can have a vision, but if they're not on pace, Murray's going to have some conflict and go exactly the way he wants to. We saw it in Groundhog's Day with Harold Ramis that just totally ended that friendship, where the visions weren't in sync. Murray has his vision of comedy, and so does the other directors. Murray has no problem on calling out a director if he thinks that something doesn't work. We see that from dramatic roles that he's attempted. We've seen that from comedies, and we've seen that later in his career that he's kind of tamed down a little bit. But we have to have, like I said, a script and a movie and a vision that's catered to Murray, or else he's going to come across as a complete asshole. And we don't get that buy-in from the character that we've seen from him in the movie. We see even in Scrooge, we see that up and down kind of version of Bill Murray where it's not a consistent role. It's a believable role, but it's not a consistent role because we're just watching the Bill Murray show on that aspect. This is one of those inconsistent actors that if you let him off the leash, he can make something memorable. So you have to have a director and even so a writer that's willing to give him a shot of improvisation to see where this creative vision goes. And I think that's one of the most successful Bill Murray movies is to let him off the hook and just let him play.
I agree with that. I think also he probably can smell blood in the water or smell fear or inconfidence of a director or of like a production team. And it's funny because I've been talking about this a lot in other episodes in the last few weeks. I had a Tango and Cash episode recently on the Cultworthy. We talked about the ego of Stallone. I just barely got off of the phone recording an episode about Hard Target and Van Damme. And those guys are very similar to Murray in the sense of like they know what they are when it comes to the presence on screen, to the box office they can bring in. And if they feel that a filmmaker or a producer is not using them to their full potential, they've got no qualms of literally stepping in and saying, I know how to shoot me. I know how to light me. I know how to capture me. I know how to edit me. Very few people can get away with that without coming off as totally toxic. And in this day and age, yeah, we consider that super toxic. But back then, I think that we were seeing the beginnings of the box office draw being the main focal point of a movie. We had our movie stars back in the day, right? We had our Paul Newmans and our Brandos and our James Deans and stuff like that. But to see that name on top of the title on a poster or in a credit sequence meant that we were there for that person, not necessarily the movie. And in our hopes, the movie lived up to the prestige of that name. And Bill Murray, after 1984, definitely had that. But it took Caddyshack, Ghostbusters, and Meatballs and Stripes to get him there. And that's why this is a very interesting time for them to have this episode, because he wasn't there yet. And I think they were a little fuzzy on what seeing the future of his career would be, because it kind of continues in the next part of the conversation.
I have a theory too, Gene, and I think my theory is illustrated in Murray's first really big hit at the box office, which was a comedy named Stripes, which came out in 1981 and involved some of the same people that he later teamed up with on Ghostbusters. Ivan Reitman, the director, and Harold Ramis, who in both movies was the co-star and the co-writer. Murray and Ramis played a couple of strange guys who enlist in the Army just for the heck of it in Stripes, and they bring their own brand of craziness to military service.
So one thing I can say about Stripes is I think that they were definitely going for, let's say, the Bing Crosby, Bob Hope dynamic, right? Where I think the plan was Ramis and Murray were supposed to be like a double act. You can tell it was written that way. It was definitely directed that way, but that is not how the film actually plays out. Murray steals the show, and it was obvious.
He steals the show, but I also go to the writing piece of it because Ramis, the writing piece of it didn't treat it like a buddy comedy. And again, I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but whatever the dialogue was, Murray amplified it. He took it up an octave, and he knew that he had to make a name for himself. This is where I kind of compare it to the John Candy performances of the 80s, where you have the regular guy, the John Candy huggable teddy bear, and then you have this guy that really does stand next to a couple of comedic legends that were, to an extent, outshining him in the comedy world back then. So he knew, based on that, he had to have the spotlight on him. And it all comes down to confidence of your own ability. Murray had confidence in his own ability. He knew what he can make of it. And he wasn't going to let any script, any filmmaker, any director, any editor, if that was the case, show him differently. And Stripes is a perfect example of that. And I'm glad we were talking about that, because this could have gone the way of numerous buddy comedies that we've seen from the past. But this is a Bill Murray movie. This is nothing else than that.
And it does have a lot of like great side performances. Like you said, John Candy, John Larroquette, kind of being like the villain, bringing his Dan Fielding energy to that role. And it is one of those movies that I think when we were younger, like our parents liked it and we liked it. It hasn't aged as well. You know, people watch it now and like, you guys think Stripes is funny? And it's like, you kind of had to be there, man. You kind of had to be there, like knowing that you were watching this after your parents went to bed because you weren't supposed to be. You know, that there's nostalgia glasses to it, but also we held movies that were irreverent in a different kind of light when we were younger because they felt taboo. That was one of them. Trading Places was one for me. Like, oh, you shouldn't be watching Trading Places. Oh, I'm watching Trading Places. You know, it's kind of that whole thing. But yeah, like you can't ignore the fact that with Ivan Reitman and Harold Ramis, seeing what that could be, like as they are planning future films together, like we can't tone this guy down. If we want him, we have to let him be who he is. And that's why Ghostbusters is the way it is. That's why Ghostbusters 2 is the way it is. And it's funny because, like, if I think about all of the movies of the 80s with Bill Murray, there's actually not as many as I think. I just think he was all over the place, but literally after Ghostbusters, it's Little Shop of Horrors, Scrooged, Ghostbusters 2, and that's the 80s for him. He had some cameos, but that's the 80s. It's just those movies. But in our minds, at least mine, I feel like he was everywhere, that he had a movie a year. He really didn't. That is why that persona that he has is so important to that decade, because he literally feels like he is just as recognizable on screen and on TV as like Tony the Tiger, right? It's just like an 80s thing that we are perfectly aware of, but it was only a handful of movies in that 10 years.
It's funny you say that, because I thought the same thing before we hopped on the show, is thinking of Bill Murray, my favorite Bill Murray movies, etc. But the thing about Bill Murray is that that we spoke to earlier is memorable, but he was marketable. This is a guy that we saw not in the theater per se all the time, but we saw him on the TV all the time. Stripes, Caddyshack, Ghostbusters. These movies were milked on home TV that we watched consistently. These are classics that we always wanted to revisit because they were entertaining, they kept the kids quiet, or like you said, they're taboo and we're going to try and watch them. We have Stripes that covered war themes, and we have Caddyshack that was just kind of just almost dirty comedy at the time. There is a lot of these movies that really did tempt us to just invite Bill Murray into the home. And he is almost like a part of the family when we go into the 90s, because you can have one movie every 5 to 10 years and you're going to say that's Bill Murray, because he grew up with most of the kids of the 80s and some of the 90s that we appreciate his comedy. This is where a lot of comedians and even normal people were introduced to comedy, because it was the Bill Murray show. And this set the standard of where comedies were going to go when it comes to what our expectation is walking into a theater, or how we view comedy on the TV. So Bill Murray set that standard because he was so repetitive on what we were accustomed to.
I like the way he makes faces at the screen. Very good. He's very relaxed in this movie, but he's also winking at us, saying, in effect, hey, look at me. I'm in this movie. Aren't movies fun? Wouldn't you like to be in this movie? Let's laugh at it all together. Bill Murray is very likable in a relaxed way in Ghostbusters. You know, it is one of the toughest moves to make in a movie, which is to look at the camera, to look into the audience's eyes, and not ruin the film. Very few people can do it. Woody Allen sometimes, Bill Murray a lot of times. We like Bill Murray so much he can get away with that. We like Groucho Marx. They're both the wittiest person in their movies. Not handsome, but funny and wisecracking and sweet and bright. That's one secret of Bill. I like to call him this, Bill Groucho Murray.
So Gene's big thing is like he's comparing him to a modern day Groucho Marx. I kind of get that. I think it's more about maybe the sarcasm than it is the actual performance. Groucho Marx literally just would have, asides and monologues to the audience, to the fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall completely. And there was a physical energy about Groucho Marx, always being hunched over with that funny little walk, always doing a lot of handwork with that cigar, the mustache. Like there was a lot to it. I think where Bill Murray is different than Groucho Marx, because I think that's an interesting comparison. I personally don't see it. Where it's Bill Murray has a very, very great talent at seeming to break the fourth wall, but he's not. He's looking at the camera. You might even feel like he's looking at the audience, but if this was like, let's say, a 3/4 shot and not a close-up on him, it would just be him like looking off camera. It would be it's almost mastering the art of breaking the fourth wall, but not. And very few people can do that. And I agree with him on that part because it is like an eye roll or a snarl or a sneer. He's really good at doing that and involving us, but not taking us completely out of the reality the movie's trying to set up. So I think that's the way that Gene envisions it. It's like, oh, he's like giving us a wink. I don't think Bill Murray needs to wink. I think the movie is like literally winking at us that Bill Murray is the star and we don't need him to essentially be the dance monkey dance guy. He wraps the movie around his performance, and I think that is what he's talking about.
Well, I don't agree with Gene on the fact that Groucho Marx was unattractive. I think he's a very attractive man when it comes to his type of acting. Just saying. But right. I think
he always gets the girl in the movies.
He really does. But what I think I am on the same page as Gene. I don't think that the comedy style is identical to Groucho Marx. I don't think Murray wants that, but I think it's the confidence versus the relaxation of the comedic timing. I think that's kind of the similarity that I would put between the two, because they both do have a confidence to them. They both have a relaxation to how they deliver their comedy. And even though Murray doesn't break the fourth wall, he almost does in a contemporary fashion, where he doesn't look at the camera, but he looks at the character with almost a side eye to the camera when he delivers his sarcastic tone. It's almost, it's contemporary, but I can see them winking at it because he knows he wants to look at the camera. We get that feeling he wants to look at the camera when he delivers something sarcastic, but he never does. And I think that is almost a brilliance in itself, is he stops himself to just be that cool, collected comedian to deliver it to his co-stars. And I think that is where I can really connect with the comparison between the two. Do we need a contemporary Groucho Marx? No, because that comedy not necessarily would hold up today, but I think it would be so far out there today that it wouldn't be relevant. Murray knows this, even in the 80s, and he tries to put his own spin on that type of comedy to still make it relevant with the relaxed, confident comedian that he is, and just kind of give a little nod in his own little way.
Yeah. You know who did it really well before Murray is Elliot Gould. Elliot Gould in the 70s and early 80s, I'm going to say starting with MASH, and then like The Long Goodbye, and The Silent Partner, and California Split, like all of my favorite movies of his in the 70s. He, I think because working with Altman so much, became so comfortable at giving his own dialogue and own creations into his character, but they're always kind of delivered under his breath or into his chest or under his brow. They're sarcastic asides that when you pick them up, they're funny. Bill Murray is doing the exact same thing, except he actually is performing them. He's not saying them under his breath, but it's the same kind of energy. And it works. Like it's an improvisational thing. Just like Altman was very big on actors improvising their lines. It kind of amazes me that Bill Murray wasn't in an Altman movie. He would have been perfect, right? He would have fit in just fine. And we see a lot more of that after this 1984 era that they're talking about. Once we get into movies like Quick Change and What About Bob and Mad Dog and Glory, we really see him become comfortable because that's what people are paying for now. Up to this point, they are still learning about what he is. And when they talk about Caddyshack, that is an interesting thing as well, because Caddyshack is him really playing a character. It's not him being Bill Murray. He is actually essentially grabbing one of his personas that he might have created when he was on Second City or on Saturday Night Live. And I think Roger's focusing more on that than Gene is on the Groucho Marx isms.
Murray plays a guy in this movie who's a little bit goofy about gophers. He's a groundskeeper at this high society country club, has customers at it like Rodney Dangerfield, and then there's Murray, who lives in this little room with this kind of grungy little existence going after those gophers. He's kind of on that level. He's just about 6 inches below the level of the golf course, as far as everybody else in the movie is concerned. Caddyshack was a movie where Murray was still feeling his way. I think he was upstaged at the box office and probably with some audiences by Rodney Dangerfield. Yeah. But the movie itself also wasn't all that great. It was important, though, to Murray because it helped him develop his on-screen persona as a bemused, slightly hostile guy who knows all the angles, even if the only angles he knew were gopher killing.
So Caddyshack, I'm actually not a fan of the movie, but I am a fan of Rodney Dangerfield, Chevy Chase, and Bill Murray in the movie. If it wasn't for those three, I really have no reason to watch it. But Dangerfield's being Dangerfield, Chase is being Chase, Murray's being completely different in this movie. He's being a character. But again, it shows that he does have range, because as goofy as that character is, he still is able to steal a lot of the movie with his shenanigans and his little lisp.
Well, let's be clear here. Caddyshack, nobody saw for the story. It was a stupid story. Nobody cared about the story. It was the ensemble here, because powerhouses, Bill Murray, Rodney Dangerfield, especially at this time, people went, it's a comedy sketch. It's almost a stand-up comedy show with some sort of subtle golfing plot in the background. Nobody cared about that. They just wanted to see these comedians do their thing. And I'm with you. I didn't like the movie, but I will watch these performances over and over and over again because they're cheeky, they're funny, and they're entertaining. So, that's why Caddyshack 2 didn't really float with me, because we didn't have this powerhouse of talent that really kept us entertained. You take any D-lister star in this movie and it's going to be a flop. We see movies like this time and time again come out, and it's okay to say, I'm not going to see this movie because it's interesting. I'm going to see this movie because of the cast. We saw it with Robin Williams. We saw it with John Candy. We saw it with a lot of these comedians that really did have the studios pumping these generic stories to the screen and having the cast do all the work. And Caddyshack is a prime example of that, because I hate the movie, but I will watch it time and time again because it is a gem of comedy talent.
I mean, Caddyshack and moments of Caddyshack 2 are really only worthwhile for like the one-liners that Rodney Dangerfield delivers, the quips that Chevy Chase delivers. If it wasn't for any of those moments, you're right. No one cares about Michael O'Keefe as the young caddy who's trying to hook up with a girl. No one cares, right? It's not that great of a movie, but those performances are. And they both agree it's not that great. And for all intents and purposes, Meatballs isn't that great either. But Bill Murray is funny, and it's a camp movie, and it was of its time. And Meatballs got like 3 sequels, which is beyond me, but whatever. They go on.
At The Razor's Edge is by no means a great film, but there is something quite wonderful about it, and you could see it in that scene where he gets, that one shot where he gets choked up. And what you can see there is the innate sweetness of Bill Murray that comes across at almost every moment in this story. He can act all right, but frankly, he's best when he just seems to be himself, his relaxed self, trying to do the right thing or the funny thing. He's a good person, and we see that, and that carries him a long way in the movies, I think.
I agree with that feeling about Murray when he's relaxed, but that's why I liked him ever so much more in Tootsie, where he was Dustin Hoffman's roommate, and he was giving him little advice. And you remember the great scene where he says, "Don't play too hard to get."
Right.
I liked him better there than I did in Razor's Edge, where he seems to be playing serious with a capital S. In other words, this is a serious movie. I have to be serious about it, and I thought as a result he was too laid back in this movie. You could see it almost, I thought, in this scene. He's standing back like this. He doesn't put himself into the scene. He doesn't put his personality into the scene. I think he's better off probably playing contemporary roles.
I've never seen The Razor's Edge, honestly, because I never really wanted to watch a drama with Bill Murray, at least in that era of his career in the mid-1980s. I've known about it since I was a kid. I mean, I remember seeing it like on Encore as I'm flipping channels and gave it 5 minutes like, oh, Bill Murray's not funny in this movie. Click, not for me, right? But I get it. I get what they're talking about when he allows himself to be more natural, because you and I've talked about this before. We think that it's easier for comedians to do drama than it is for dramatic actors to do comedy. And he's a really great example of that, where there are moments where he does do drama, especially in like the late 90s and up into the 2000s working with Wes Anderson. When he's in those Wes Anderson movies, he is not the comic relief. He is legit like the anchor, the dramatic anchor of a lot of those movies. So it shows that he can do that. His role in St. Vincent, same thing, where he is being more of a dramatic, or Broken Flowers. We can see him do drama and it works. So I think that he did get chances to pursue his more dramatic side later on in his career, when I feel like box office clout and the It's Me show of the 90s with these comedies kind of wore off and he was ready to do more with his presence. I think that's when we really see it. And I think they would have been a lot prouder of those performances, because unfortunately in both of their lifetimes, they didn't get a lot of those. They kind of were through the dance monkey dance Bill Murray era.
Razor's Edge was, I will agree with them. It is a complete subtle performance, and it's not something that we can see on screen Murray's confidence, but we can also see his struggle. And the 90s was the transition for a lot of great comedians to really get into the dramatic role. We saw it with Williams. We saw it here with Bill Murray, where the 90s was the decade of let's tap our toes in the water and see how it goes. Murray, we can see with each and every role, from Lost in Translation to, which I think was a pivotal moment with him, that he really did match his subtleness to the style of the director that we spoke to earlier. It connected with him. And as any movie past that, we can see him learn and grow as a dramatic actor. Is it still believable? No, because we have that expectation of Murray as a comedian that we've just been accustomed to, that's been drilled into our heads on how we should portray a Murray movie. And that is the death of the salesman when it comes to a comedian. So I think Murray, when it comes to Razor's Edge, it wasn't ready for him, but at the same time, it got his feet wet to what was to come in the 90s. I think he would have struggled a lot more with a lot of the movies that he picked in the 90s if it wasn't for Razor's Edge, because by the end of the movie, we can kind of feel that he was getting into his groove. We can feel that he was actually transitioning and understanding the dialogue and how to portray with a little Murray-esque kind of subtlety. But the 90s is Murray's true test of how he executed it. And was it flawless? No. But we did have sparks of what Murray can do when it comes to his range, but nowhere near, if I had to make a comparison, of how Robin Williams adjusted to the dramatic 90s.
Well, I feel that after 1995, he had like a string of just paycheck movies, right? Like, just give me the paycheck, give me the paycheck, give me the paycheck. Larger Than Life, Space Jam, The Man Who Knew Too Little, Wild Things, and then Rushmore in 98. Now, I'm not saying I don't like those movies. I actually have a good time with those movies, but are they top tier? Hell no. They are literally paycheck movies. You know, while we're on that subject of like his dramatic side, in Tootsie, I think the scene that makes me always laugh the most is literally a scene where he and Dustin Hoffman essentially switch places performance-wise, where I feel like Murray is channeling Hoffman and Hoffman is channeling Murray. And that's the scene where Sandy shows up and he's just getting out of his Tootsie makeup and he's in the shower. And Hoffman is screaming, I got shampoo in my eyes and I can't get out. He's doing Bill Murray performance in that scene where it's way over the top, way over dramatic and over comedic. Meanwhile, Murray is just mumbling through the door as if he's using a Dustin Hoffman patois, trying to calm the situation down. It's my favorite scene in the movie because I honestly feel like the two literally said, hey, I'm going to act like you in this scene. Okay, fine. I'm going to act like you in this scene. And they traded energies. And every time I watch that movie, it's my favorite scene because there's like this shift between the two of them where I feel like they're exchanging performances.
We can imagine that scene, and I love scenes like that in a movie where you can tell they're bouncing off of each other. We can tell that the scene has a little bit of improvisation to it, and
Mhm.
I love it when they kind of have fun with it. When we have almost a compare and contrast from what the rest of the movie in a single scene, that's where the fun happens, and that's where it gets really interesting when it comes to how to view these characters. And are we going to define Murray by a single scene when it comes to how we can dress him? Absolutely not. But at the same time, it shows a little seedling of how he can actually work with others when it comes to improvisation in a scene, how he can kind of test his range with another actor that we've seen some difficulty in some movies with him. But Dustin Hoffman, I give him credit to working with this because Dustin Hoffman was hot at this point. And
The hottest.
the at his peak. So
Yeah.
this is where we can tell we almost want to look at a backstory of how these two interacted without knowing any backstory and take us to our happy land of how these two were behind the scenes. What Dustin Hoffman did to kind of motivate this scene because he was a scene controller and a nice guy, but he did kind of push some limits to some scenes on his co-stars to really kind of push the limits to what a scene could potentially be. And that is a scene that I love that you used as an example because that is a perfect example of the Hoffman magic mixed with the Murray magic.
Yeah, when you have that, probably at the time, one of the two most method actors in the industry, like him and Pacino, man, like they were known to like out method each other. And then you've got Bill Murray, who is by far the least method actor. He turns it on and turns it off on a whim. In fact, sometimes I don't even think he turns it on. I think he's just on, right? And to have them pair up in those scenes, and all those scenes are magic. Like, I think that is one of the gifts of being an improv. I'm not going to say comic, just an improv actor, is that you learn how to adjust yourself based off of the performance of the other person. That is where I am in more the school of thought of non-method acting. Because I really feel that method actors are so involved in their own persona and performance that they don't listen and react to the other person involved because they've already set the character in mind. And we've seen that in way too many movies. Sean Penn's a perfect example where Sean Penn, Casualties of War, perfect example. He is not reacting to his other performers in that movie. He is this guy and he controls the scene. Meanwhile, Murray, if it's not his movie, if it's not his show, he is listening and reacting and he's playing jazz with the energy of the scene, which makes it seem so much more naturalistic than the so-called actor on frame. And Tootsie's not the only example. He does it in a lot of movies. So kudos to him on that.
It's reminded me of Christopher Walken and Steven Spielberg, where they did a scene in a film where Christopher Walken said, "Give me 4 takes." And that's it. And he went through the motions of casual humor, over the top emotion, to just internally feeling pain. And by the last take, it was a complete masterpiece. It was the final take and they went with it. And I hate method acting. I really do hate it. If it was a one man show, if it was something where you are just with a co-star, fine. But the real magic happens when you are improvising, where the cameras are rolling and you're just going with it. And we saw that a lot on film that was a lot more wasteful in the 80s than we do now. And it shocks me that we don't get more of that now because that is where we, more times than not, get a lot of the human connection. We get a lot of the funny moments. You go back to any comedy, any drama, and I guarantee you the most memorable moment from that movie is going to be an improvisation of how we deliver our lines on screen. And I think that is where a lot of Bill Murray's movies really do get it right, is, again, allowing him off the leash. Method acting has its time and its place. but not in every single movie that we hear actors talk about over and over again, where I'm going to do Caddyshack 40 and I'm going to get into this character and I'm going to deep dive and be in isolation for 2 weeks. It doesn't work that way. So to me, an ensemble is underrated when it comes to some talents, and they go all in on the method acting, and it drives me absolutely batshit crazy.
I think where the improvisational actors ended up going and those kind of stories, they started being told on TV. Because if you think about it, in the 70s, 80s, it was very scripted, and not just scripted, like hyper programmed and processed sitcoms and hour-long melodramas, all to sell advertising. So improvisation was very discouraged. So that why we saw more of it on film. And I think it's gone the opposite direction, because now TV is more free flowing. It's more free form. Curb Your Enthusiasm, Arrested Development. A lot of these are just off the cuff. Here's the idea of the scene. Here are some points we need to make. But other than that, you guys go. You guys just do it. So I feel that has all gone to TV and streaming and short form, or maybe long form episodic shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm. And then movies have kind of gone back to really structured and standardized. And the fact that we had the rise of the writer-director auteurs of the 90s that were like, do not change my dialogue. I think we had to live with that for a long time too. Anyway, they finish up with this last little piece of conversation about Bill Murray.
You know, you do have that feeling with Bill Murray that he is making it up as it goes along, that everybody else in the movie, their characters, they have their lines. They're standing there in the story saying the things that somebody wrote for them, and Murray is standing there saying, gee, that's interesting. I wonder how they came up with that. Here's what I think about it. And we have the feeling in the audience that he's speaking to us, that he is somehow the guy from the 10th row who got into the movie, and he's able to represent us and our viewpoint in terms of all the other characters in the story.
Yeah, there's no question. He looks always like he's a last-minute replacement. He's just in there and saying, by the way, I think of this. Or like the little cartoonist Pat Oliphant, who always has a little birdie in the corner. That little birdie is Bill Murray, I think, sometimes. Yeah.
So I like what Roger said about that, because I agree. And I think the perfect example of that is, I'm going to call it his 90s trifecta. Quick Change in 1990, What About Bob in 91, and then Groundhog Day in 93, where these are like the main Bill Murray shows. In Quick Change, he has to play it more realistic because he is a bank robber on the run. He's got his two cohorts with him. He's got Randy Quaid and Gina Davis. And it allows the humorous situations to happen with the surroundings, but he's not as humorous as he is. He has to kind of keep it in one place. He can't be too crazy. What About Bob is as crazy as you want to be, because he's literally playing a crazy guy. And he's got super neurotic Richard Dreyfuss to bounce off of too. So that apparently that was a nightmare set to work on, but the energy on film really, really works. It's Groundhog Day that I think is the apex of that, because what he said about being hyper aware of everything, of all knowing, I'm going to use the word omnipotent. His character of Phil is the omnipotent character of this movie. Essentially, he exists in his own universe. And yes, it is a nightmare and a curse to live the same day over and over again, but he literally realizes that in this universe, he's essentially a god if he wants to be, or his own worst enemy if he allows himself to be. And so the comedic and dramatic shifts in tone that he has to demonstrate in that movie really is a perfect example of what he's talking about. That kind of hyper-awareness, almost over-knowing, overseeing performer in his own movie, where he's like not only the actor, but he's also like the writer, the director, the producer. It's everything. That's what Groundhog Day feels like to me.
Groundhog Day, like I spoke to earlier, is Bill Murray's sandbox. And I think this was Harold Ramis's big conflict with Murray at this point, is that it was a big sandbox. And there are so many ideas that could have gone into this, especially when you're taking a story that lives over and over and over again on what we do differently, whether it's not far enough or it's too subtle enough. There's a lot of conflicting creative ideas that can happen on set with this. And this is where Murray, I think, gets a little bit frustrating, or I should say, he gets frustrated that it doesn't feel like from point A to point C, there's nothing in between to really have that difference, that really have that expansion of what happened prior. So it makes sense that there was some conflict here. Is you give a movie that requires repetitiveness, and Murray's mind just goes wild on what could happen with this movie. And I think this movie, even though I love Groundhog's Day, it's one of my faves, but I still think if it was a different kind of movie, it could have gone a little bit further on letting Murray off the leash to see what we can do. But I do give Ramis some credit here that he really did have a leash on Murray to an extent to really hold him back, to really drive the story and not make it a full stand-up comedy Bill Murray show.
So I'm going to ask you this question because they are covering up until 1984, but we've kind of discussed his three biggest decades. So I'm going to ask you the question. What is your favorite decade of Murray? Is it the 80s? Is it the 90s? Or is it the 2000s? I'm not going to say 2010s and up because he's very sparse and is doing a lot of different things, a lot of TV. But those films now, 80s, 90s, 2000s, what's your decade?
It has to be the 80s because those are the movies I always go to. But I'm not going to discredit the 90s because as Murray gets older, it's like a fine wine. He is appreciated more and his acting style is matured a lot. But it's hard to get rid of that kid in me from Little Shop of Horrors, Ghostbusters. Those are movies that I really did watch over and over and over again, including Scrooge. So it's hard to get the Bill Murray of the 80s out of my head. And I think a lot of people will resonate with that because that's where we see him as a rising star just almost overnight with some of these movies.
I want to be on your team with that one because it is so important. But I think when it comes to the rewatchability factor, because that's a big thing for me. If I'm watching movies over and over again or repeatedly throughout a year, that's the one that I'm going to have to pick. And that's the 90s for me. Quick Change, Groundhog Day, Mad Dog and Glory, and Kingpin. Like, I will watch those repeatedly throughout the year. I just can't not. And you got Rushmore in 98 too. And I watch Rushmore at least 3 times a year. It probably is my favorite Wes Anderson movie to this day. I'm not saying that he's made a bad one, but it really is my favorite. And Bill Murray's a big part of that. So the 90s for me, for sure. But man, the 80s, if you put it on paper, the fact that you've got the 2 Ghostbusters movies and Stripes and Little Shop of Horrors and Scrooged, it's really hard to not say the 80s were his decade. And probably they are, but 90s is the one I'm going with.
It is really hard because between the 80s and 90s, there is an appreciation for the 90s because Kingpin, I'm with you, is still, to me, one of the greatest comedies in my lifetime that I've never
100%
laughed so hard in my life. But then we have a lot of the nuggets of the kind of the question marks, like Larger Than Life, that happens just directly after. So if it wasn't for kind of the random movies we have in here from Murray, I would 100% be on board and agree. But I don't want to discredit it because the 90s was a good time for Murray too. And he had some legendary movies like What About Bob that I literally can watch on loop for like a week straight.
Agreed. This is a great conversation. I'm glad that we were able to do this one. And thank you. I believe it was Mikey over in the Discord that suggested this one. He's always suggesting great stuff. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have one more listener request to fill out the month of February. And then Justin and I just decided a couple weeks ago that March is going to be our month of musicals. So musicals that Siskel and Ebert rated and reviewed on their show, which is fun because that's 70s, 80s, and a chunk of the 90s. I'm going to pick 2. Justin's going to pick 2. I have no idea what he's going to pick, although I have a very sneaking suspicion that one of them I absolutely hate, and we'll have to see. We haven't even really done a musical other than All That Jazz, and that's on all of the shows that we've done. Like your guest spots over in the Cultworthy, we've never done a musical. So we're going to see how this goes because we know that Justin loves musicals. I am not the world's biggest fan, although the handful of ones that I do like, I like with a passion, and I will defend them to the end. So I might bring a couple of those, but we'll see. They're going to be completely surprises for the month of March. So yeah, looking forward to that. So anyway, everyone, stay tuned for next week. Thank you for liking, listening, reviewing, subscribing to the show. Jump on, give it 5 stars. Follow us on YouTube. We are so close to 100 subscribers on YouTube. Please jump on there, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and keep sending in those requests. Guys, I've got a backlog. We'll probably do like a month of requests during the summer because I've got like 3 or 4 that are kind of building up, and those are a lot of fun. And then some of the ones that are on the list after the musical March are ones that we've never even seen before, and I'm looking forward to those. Find me, Antonio, at The Cult Worthy at thecultworthy.com. You can find my friend Justin over at
TheMovieWire.com.
And I will see you next week.
See you next week.